So thank you very much for having me today. My name is Gail Orenstein, and I'm a photojournalist and drone journalist. And I've been working as a photojournalist for 25 years, covering conflicts and humanitarian crises around the world. And today I'm going to discuss my journey from photojournalism to drone journalism. And I'm also going to talk quite a bit about hybrid journalism, what I sort of define as still keeping very much in the tradition of photojournalism and traditional technology, using cameras and videos, and now using aerial photography. So I think that gives you a bit of an introduction. We can move on to the next slide. Okay, I'm actually going to do something kind of fun here, where I'm going to bring us back to December. I'm going to actually put my helmet on that I had during that time. This is December 2014, and this slide is me running behind a Kurdish soldier. And this is when I was smuggled into Syria, and I spent a week there at Christmas time. And this visual is quite important, actually, to make the point about photojournalism and going from traditional technology into drone journalism, because when you're in a conflict zone, most people don't really think about sort of the behind the scenes of things that you're doing, and you're literally running through places like this, and so you're very close to the soldiers, and this is obviously something you can't do with a drone. So I'm going to be making a clear argument that I'm not leaving photojournalism, but I am adding a very important piece of technology to my arsenal here. So we can move on. Okay, these are traditional shots that you see in the media. This I was taken when I was in Syria, and I am behind a building for many reasons, for safety, and this is when there was Islamic State was in Syria, and there were many heavy battles going on at the time. So this is used through traditional means of photography. We can move on. Okay, this is an interesting image because I'm carrying a traditional camera here, and again, I'm on the ground following. This is a Kurdish media representative, and this is how we basically were able to capture and document the heavy battle in Kobani in Syria, and again using sort of this traditional method of documenting a war zone. So we can go on to the next one. Okay, and these are obviously some of the things that you see when you're on the ground using traditional media. You're faced with, very difficult situations. Moving, it's very hard for me. Remember, I don't have control of my slides. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to scroll down here. Okay, so the first time that you have to remember, I've been a photojournalist for 25 years, and I'm very used to gun battle, used to rocket launchers, very used to these sounds of conflict areas. And the first time that I had really experienced a sort of use of the word drone and experienced it in real life was in Syria. And we we were in a safe house, and there was a loud boom, and it was a very unfamiliar sound to me. And I looked around. Well, all the windows had been blown out, but it literally felt like the earth went up and then came down really hard. And I looked around and I said, you know, wow, what is that? What was that? That was different. And they immediately said that it was an American drone strike, you know, and they sort of cheered, yay, you know, Obama, yay, yay. And so it was a very strange situation, pretty surreal. So that was my first military drone strike that I actually had experienced. And, of course, I knew of them, but I actually was in one. So that was a very, very strange experience. The next slide is one we visited. A commander had taken us to some of the area and the building that the damage had done from some of the drone strikes that were happening there. And you can see I'm still at this point using traditional media to capture the area that I'm covering in Syria. So we can move to the next slide. Okay. I think it's really critical to understand that a lot of times right now I'm asked just about drone journalism. And I think one thing I need to be careful and make a very clear point is that that is great technology. It's wonderful technology. But for many reasons, I really do believe in hybrid journalism, and I want to make that very clear that I'm not a purist in the sense that I just go and just do drone journalism. It's very important, I think, to use many mediums, but as we continue with this, you will see why I do feel it is critical at times to include the use of using aerial footage, but that is not just my primary tool. And I do, as I say, I come from a photojournalism background. Most people don't fly the way that I fly. I fly very much the way that I am as a photojournalist. I fly in conflict zones, but I tend to fly very low because I'm used to being, as a photojournalist, with the crowd, with the conflict on the front line. We might want to go to the next slide, which is did you move to the next one?
I did. A person going into a kind of a whole area?
Yeah. So, and one of the reasons why, obviously, you couldn't drone, you know, that it is important to use different technologies is that when you're a war correspondent, you're going through a lot of buildings, and when we tend to see, the thing is, we see post-production, so you don't see behind the scenes what's happening. But I'm actually running many times through buildings to get to another place. It's very not very often that we would be in an open air space, and so again, for these are interesting shots in that you get to sort of see behind the scenes how we're functioning as war correspondents. And so right now I'm following a person from the Kurdish media unit, and this is trying to get to the city center at the front line. So we can move to the Okay. Again, this is just, we're at the front line now, and you can see still the use, very heavy use of traditional technology. This is shot with, now I was smuggled into this area, so also the thing is and I'll talk about this in a minute, but you have to be very careful about the technology you bring. Now, I have Leicas, I have D4S, I have very expensive equipment, but when you are in a combat zone, in a conflict environment, for example, this is a D3, and it's a Nikon. It's a traditional workhorse, and, you know, when you're smuggled into an area, you don't want to have a lot of equipment on you. So we'll talk about this. This is where a lot of small drone technology, you'll start to see where it really has an impact on work. Okay, we can move to the, okay. So what happened was I had, after I left Syria, after I was smuggled out of Syria, I had a lot of publicity, mostly because I was covering the female fighters from the Kurdish YPJ. And I was published quite heavily at the time of this particular story. But when I came back, I saw something, we can go to the next slide, that was a real game changer. And this was done by Gabriel Haim. If you want to play this, please. Okay.
I don't know that it'll play, Gail. I'm sorry. I don't think the video came through.
That's really too bad. Okay. Okay. Well, this piece of footage, I was watching one night. It was on CNN, and it was done by. He is literally considered to be the first drone journalist. His name is Gabriel Haim. When I saw his footage of Kobani, which I had just left, this was a complete game changer for me. I felt completely different about everything. When I saw this drone footage that he did, when I saw the aerial footage he did of Kobani, and I looked at the traditional footage I did, I absolutely, I felt sort of in a way that had not captured the story. I felt very disappointed in myself, and it was a strange mix of emotions, because on the one hand people were like, wow, you did you were in Syria, frontline work, but I'd been used to that, so that wasn't a big issue for me. When I watched Gabriel's drone footage, that was a complete game changer. I just thought, no way will I ever do any conflict, humanitarian work, whatever it is that I'm on assignment. I will never ever go without a drone. So I'm sorry we can't view the footage, but if you just Google his name, you'll be able to see his work. We can move to the next slide. Okay, so off I go. I decided after watching Gabriel's footage, I went to Bath and I did intense training. And I was very vigilant. I had a brilliant trainer by the name of Peter Milner at the Phoenix UAV Flight School in Bath. Peter works closely with the Civil Aviation Authority. I just knew after seeing Gabriel's footage, I really had to have this piece of equipment, but I had to really get a grip on how to use it extremely well, become knowledgeable about its use, because I was about to take it into extreme cases where most people don't take any quadcopters. You know, remember that in my case, okay, I do something very strange. I don't do something that most people do. Using drones in conflict and humanitarian crises is not usually how they're used. So I knew at that moment I had to be, trained by the best. So I had 2 weeks, and I was ready to go. And here I am on top of a refugee camp. I'm on the roof, and this is my first flight in Iraq, and I'm in Kurdistan here. And what had happened here, and you might want to go to the next slide, is that I had my Phantom 3 Pro was impounded at the airport. So this was my first time bringing any drones really to my new family. This was kind of like a new addition. This was like, not just another Leica or a Nikon or a Canon. This was like, wow, okay, I now have these amazing tools with me, but there's no standardization anywhere. And these countries are telling me, nope, you can't bring that there. And so fortunately, I actually had a little parrot bebop on me, and they didn't impound that. So they impounded this immediately, and it is because, yes, at the time, first of all, these Phantoms were being weaponized against the population in Mosul. And also the Iraqi military and the Kurds, the Peshmerga, and the KRG, the Kurdish regional government, were using this type of drone. So they weren't going to let me in with this, because they themselves, at that time, this drone was actually, pretty high-tech. So they were using that as well. And I had been invited to the security offices to view what they were doing. And I was very surprised to see some of the things that this Phantom 3, they may have had the Phantom 4 at the time, I'm not sure. This was approximately about March 2017, so they probably had Phantom 4 at the time. But, this is really, changes very quickly. So all of this was new. Now we have the folding, the Air. We're up to the Air already, and, a new Mavic is about to be released. So anyway, I did have my parrots, and off I went, and I was able to drone all over the place, and that was a new addition to my work. I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is one of the first camps, and this is actually really an important slide, because this is one of the first views that I had using my quadcopter. Now, although it was a parrot, I have to say, my Phantom was still with the Asayish, with the Kurdish security. So at this point, I'm droning around with a parrot. But you know what? It's working really well. So my hat's off to Parrot. Even though people don't see it as a professional drone, I was involved in this, droning in conflict zones at a very early stage. So I took it very seriously, because I completely saw the story very different. So when I approached the refugee camps, I was able to, I do surveys, things that I never imagined that profoundly changed the way I told the story. And so I was invited by the Barzani Foundation to come and drone this first camp. And so I was able to get amazing, really, footage with this small drone that I had. And after that, I spent several months in Iraq droning the conflict of the siege in Mosul. But this is one of the very first pieces of footages that came from me bringing this new equipment to Iraq. So I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay. Then it really did change the way I told stories. And after I left Iraq, I was off quite quickly to the Rohingya crisis on the border of the Myanmar border. I was there quite early, and that was when you were still able to get up to the border, called Tumbro. Now, this border area is critical in that this is where hundreds of thousands of Rohingya fled, and you can't get access there anymore. So I was really fortunate to be able to get up there and get some shots. Now, this is actually about 20 kilometers away from the border. This is when there were not that many humanitarian agencies. I did see MSF there. They were just starting to set up some triages. And this shot was taken with, I'm pretty sure this was with my DJI. And this is one of the first camps that was built in Bangladesh. So I'm starting to think about ways now to tell a very different story using drones. But it's very difficult because you have to remember I'm in many microclimates in Bangladesh. 1 minute there was a monsoon, the next minute it was dry. So you're dealing with a lot of technical difficulties at this stage when you start to get into these kind of larger humanitarian crises. You're thinking about, okay, the next day, will I even be able to get there? Will the roads be flooded? So there's environmental degradation you have to really think about. Very, very complex issues that come up. Battery issues, charging issues. It starts to get very battery intensive. I've now got 8 batteries with me for my Phantom. I've got 4 for my Parrot. I've got, so it starts to become quite heavy as you decide to add these kinds of new technologies to your arsenal. So we can go on now to the next slide. One thing though, this is just going back really quickly. I think I'm trying to make a point about one into my arsenal. My colleague Jonathan in his Islamic State, and so we're having, I don't have my helmet on. We're both unprotected in that sense, and we're, running. This is incredibly dangerous. And I think one thing that's been an amazing part of having the use of quadcopters now is that I'm able to reduce a lot of dangerous situations for myself that I previously had really put myself in. When I'm sitting alone and I review some of my footage and look at some of these photographs, sometimes I'm like, wow, really, Gail, really? Like, it can be pretty terrifying, but I've been very lucky, and the uses of drones has definitely reduced some of the dangers that I face. So we can move on. Yeah, and the other thing is being able to look at photojournalism and drone journalism, and how bringing news gathering, really being able to survey areas and have more mathematical information, more concrete information, mapping, looking at, and being able to report to NGOs and say, technically, this is what this area looks like now. This is, it was very hard to do that with traditional media, whereas now using aerial technology obviously has been an important part of bringing different types of information to help NGOs and to sort of, if you will, bring a kind of different picture of a news story into your storytelling. We can move on. So the interesting thing about using drones in a conflict zone is that when you're, as a photojournalist, you do have stills, you have videos, and you're able to tell these sort of bits and pieces, these snippets of the story. But I find using a drone now in these conflict zones and these humanitarian crises, you really are flying over like the full-blown story. It's not for me fragmented as much. You're really getting a grand sense of what the space is all about, and that's so critical. And when I review my footage from even 2-3 years ago to back from 25 years ago, it's like I'm moving from snippets of what I went through, and then when I review my aerial footage, it sort of brings me into a completely different space of viewing. It's an amazing thing to be able to do. So it brings a completely different narrative to storytelling. We can move on. And as I'm sort of making a point about when you see an aerial view, you sort of get what I call the full action in environment of everything. So, sorry, I am getting a ringing in back. Okay, we can move to the next slide, please. The next one after that. Okay, just making the point about moving towards using many different types of technologies. If we don't do that, I think that we will lose out to our audience, because if you look at the way combat videos are made with CGI now, and the way that they use in combat videos the high CGI and the aerial shots, I think people are becoming more desensitized to news, not just obviously through playing video games, but we need to find a way to bring a more unique way to storytelling. And I really believe that drone journalism has allowed us to do that. And I think if we don't continue to do that, we're going to lose out in the future. We're gonna lose our audience. We have to find more creative ways to bring a humanitarian crisis, to bring a conflict crisis to our audience, because people are infiltrated with so much on the internet that I feel the ability to incorporate the use of aerial imagery and more technical information will hopefully bring back a lot of interest in humanitarian stories. We can move to next slide. Okay, I can't see that. So that just goes back to my point, I think, about the fact that we have to compete with all of these other sort of types of mediums, and I pretty much discussed that slide. We can move forward. Okay, so I think I'm getting to a closure here pretty much, and I wanted to use some still footages as to why it's so important to remember that a lot of people are asking me, they're so enthusiastic about the drone journalism, but you know, I really feel it's so important to remember shots like this you can't get with a drone. And that's really critical to remember, that shots like this are still so important, and for us not to get carried away with technology. These are still wars, they're still humanitarian crises, and they still involve faces. And we can't ever lose that. And there was a time when I was in Iraq where I did feel I was just doing too much drone journalism, and I was just getting too far from the story, and I had to really pull back from using the drone technology so much. I just thought, you know, I'm missing so much. I need to be with the people again, because I was trained as a photojournalist my training is a very hardcore kind of photojournalism. You just shoot with a very short lens. I always shot with a 14mm, right in the middle of everything. You never lose touch with what is going on the ground, because if you do, you lose touch with the emotion. So now with the flying robot, it's great. You've got the aerial view, but do you lose touch with the emotion? I started to, but then I sort of pulled the drone back, and sort of it became just an extension of how I actually used my cameras. That's why people are always like, boy, you know, you drone really low. Well, I'm not going to do that, obviously, in London. But, I drone, we have to remember, keep the narrative has to be where I am. I'm in a humanitarian environment. I'm in conflict zones. I'm in war zones. So, yes, I do drone very carefully and safely, but I do tend to keep the drone very close. That has to do a lot with the emotional aspects of things. When I first started droning in conflict zones and humanitarian crises, yeah, I did, I was always in visual line of sight. I want to make that very clear, always. But, still, even with VLOS at times, I still felt like it's too far. I just got to bring this baby closer. It's just like I got to grab this emotion. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is the in Bangladesh. This is the Rohingya, and we're here at a stage where if you look back at some of my Syrian shots when I'm in Syria, and the danger, all that, this was a situation where humanitarian aid was just trickling in, and literally there was one food truck when I was in the Bukali food distribution center, and these Rohingya were waiting for food to be distributed, and I got on top of the truck. I think we can go to the next shot. And this was, yeah, so it started to get a little bit tricky because people were in a panic, and of course they wanted, they're hungry and they want food. We can go to the next shot. And, they started to shake the truck, and I just thought, what, for safety reasons, wow, I have an option this time. I'm going to get off this truck before it tips, because it's about to tip, and I'm going to get down and I'm going to drone this. And I think I have the next slide shows, yeah. So it may be hard to see, but I was right in the middle there on top of the truck, and people are, it doesn't look like a lot of people from a distance, but people are still coming towards this one little vehicle in the middle. And it's at that point I decided I gotta get off, and I gotta get away and get the drone footage. This is a still from when I left that truck. You saw the shots prior to that where people are reaching out, but at that time they were also shaking the truck from the pushing and shoving. Now, unfortunately, a few days prior to this, there had been a stampede at one of the trucks where several Rohingya had been killed. So for safety reasons, this, I have the choice now, and I got off and I made a conscious decision to drone this footage. So we can move on. Okay, so as I'm coming to closure, this is still new technology that's emerging. It's still in its infancy, and it is really critical that there is some kind of standardization put in place. And one reason is obviously because as I'm flying to Iraq and I'm going to Sudan and I'm going all over the world, all of these places have not policy. So I'm trying to sort of still figure out, the fleet that I need to bring with me. I'm very confident at this point that the smaller drones I'm using now, like the Air and the Mavic, and I still use my Parrot, because some argue it looks like a toy, but actually that's not a bad thing, because it's at much less risk of being impounded. And one thing people have to remember is that when you're doing this kind of work, you go really far to get to your job. So when I was at the Myanmar border and the Rohingya are fleeing, that took me 2 days to get there. I had to fly to Oman, and then once I got to Oman and I flew to Chittagong, from Chittagong I still had to get to Cox's Bazar. That was another 3 hours. So once I was even in Bangladesh, the journey is incredibly far. So you really have to have quite a lot of gear with you, thinking that the bigger drones will be highly likely are going to be impounded. So, and there are a lot of, legal protections that you have to think about. It's very high risk, and you really have to think, you really have to be insured quite well as you're covering these situations around the world. I think there might be 1 or 2 more slides. I did discuss this. This has to do with what I see as being important, which are the smaller drones being a factor in drone journalism and the work in covering humanitarian crises. But then again, as I see more humanitarian agencies using drones, they are using larger drones to do food drops and things like that. There is a Japanese company that is working on extended arms to do humanitarian food drops. And so on the one hand, I think humanitarian aid groups that use drones will be using larger drones, perhaps for mapping and for the physical use of dropping aid in very difficult environments to get to, such as Bangladesh in the monsoon and during the cyclone season. These are very hard areas to reach, but for a drone journalist, a smaller kit is definitely necessary. I think we can move on. Yeah, so just in closing, I want to say that the slide here, I am actually in a refugee camp. It's really important when you do work like this to remember that most of the drones that have been used on these populations, they've been weaponized against the civilians. And I always really feel it's so critical for people to be able to touch and feel and be with the type of technology, this new type of technology that I'm using, because often it frightens people. And I remember when I first started droning in Iraq, young children were running away from me. And as a photojournalist, that is the first time I ever experienced that, and I really didn't like it. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to change that, because that's not something I'm used to, and I don't like it. And so I have a very strong belief that any drone journalist and any training I would ever give a drone journalist, and often young people ask me this, and the first thing I would say is make sure you know how powerful the technology is that you are about to bring into these areas, because most of the people will only have heard their narrative of a drone. They understand it's some kind of flying thing, but then you've got that flying thing in your hand, and they're like, what is that? And they get kind of freaked out. So I definitely would, and I feel a great responsibility, because as a photojournalist, even 25 years ago, people knew what a camera was. But now with this new technology, this population needs to see what you're doing. And you have, I feel, some would argue I'm wrong. I feel very strongly it's very important to have them understand what you're doing before you have this possible thing that's been used as a weapon against them hovering over their heads. So I strongly believe in a teaching ethic about drone journalism. So I think that's it. I'll take questions if you feel comfortable about that, Patrick.
Thank you so much.